I'm Paul Elkin. I'm the curator of the Industrial Museum and the city's new Maritime Heritage Centre. I'm standing in the Albion dockyard, just a few yards from where you're watching this video. I want to take you on a short tour of the harbour and try and explain why shipbuilding is no longer the major industry in Bristol that it used to be. There were 10 more shipyards around this area at one time in the last century. The Albion dockyard, which opened in 1820, is now the last one. Still, it's nice to see that all around me there are ships and boats of all sizes being worked on, and you can see all the main types of construction that have been used in shipbuilding over the last 200 years in the yard. Bristol ships had to be well built to cope with the River Avon. Like some of our old harbours, this one is several miles inland. The tides in the River Avon are some of the highest and the most ferocious in the world, so they didn't say shipshape and Bristol fashion for nothing. Take Peggy here. She's an 80-year-old Bristol Channel pilot cutter. Any 18th century Bristol shipwright would have been completely at home with the way her hull is made. Some new planks have been steamed in that chest over there and then bent to fit the shape of her frames. Still, if Peggy was launched now, she'd sink like a stone. Just look at these gaps between the planks. That's where the oakum and the packing and the caulking mallet do their stuff. Look at this view of the old harbour, painted about 200 years ago. There's a small boat like Peggy in the picture, but the really interesting thing are the number of very large ships crowded against the quays. What a busy and important place the old harbour was then. Shipbuilding was really big business, and the most important shipbuilder of that time, who was featured in the Maritime Centre, was James Hillhouse. This model gives us some idea of how much wood was needed just to make the frames of a large wooden ship in the 18th century. About 50 acres of trees were needed to make one large wooden warship or merchantman. I'm standing on the deck of Pascal Flores. She was built in 1917 to carry fruit and fish across the North Atlantic. Now she's being rebuilt in Bristol as a sail training ship. Compared to what any of us might travel on today, she's very tiny indeed. But in the 18th century, she would have been considered about average, indeed quite a respectable size. Certainly no one in Bristol would have thought twice about setting off halfway around the world in her. Imagine yourself halfway across the North Atlantic in a gale on a ship this size, and you'll begin to get a fair idea of how brave and adventurous some of those old Bristol seamen really were, and how much they depended on the skill of shipwrights like James Hillhouse to build them a truly strong and seaworthy vessel. Huge pieces of oak were bolted together to make the frames of the ship, and as you can see, there's not a lot of space left between them, so when they were covered with thick planking both inside and out, it formed a solid wall of timber as much as ½ a metre thick on some of the largest ships. But that wasn't the end of the story. Large wooden knees like this were used to reinforce and stiffen the deck beams, and even in the 18th century a lot of iron brackets were used to reinforce the whole hull structure. A number of the account books kept by James Hillhouse have survived. They record the amount of money that he was paying for timber, for shipbuilding and for repairs. This one from the early 19th century shows a steady increase in the price of timber during the Napoleonic War because homegrown supplies were becoming more and more scarce. After the war ended, the local shipyards, who were already bringing timber from places like the Forest of Dean, had to begin to import more and more timber from abroad. This timber yard has been here since the 18th century, and it was originally here to supply timber to boatyards that were on either side of it and have now disappeared. Those houses over there are on Baltic Wharf and Canada Wharf. They were once the site of the largest timber yards in the whole of the dock area. The names give us a reminder of where the timber came from. Fleets of ships were kept busy all the year round fetching this timber. They had special hatches in the bows so the logs could be passed out of the holes straight into the water of the harbour. It was quite common to see huge rafts of timber floating in the harbour until the end of the last century, when wooden shipbuilding died out altogether. Things began to change very rapidly in the shipbuilding industry at the beginning of the last century. James Hillhouse had actually built the first steamship seen in Bristol as early as 1813. These early steamships all had wooden hulls and were driven along by paddle wheels. but they still had masts and sails to get them out of trouble, just in case the engines and boilers broke down. They were only used really for very short sea voyages to begin with. But by 1835, a brilliant young engineer called Isambard Brunel came along and was about to prove to everyone that steamships could be used quite safely for much longer ocean voyages. And what's more, they could do something no sailing ship could be relied on to do, and that was run to a strict timetable. It doesn't sound too much of a problem, does it, getting a steamship across the North Atlantic to America? But believe me, in Brunel's day, that was just about as tricky as putting a man on the moon is for us now. However, Brunel proved that it could be done with a wooden-hulled paddle steamship called the Great Western. She was built in William Patterson's shipyard, behind me. Don't forget that when she came down the slipway over there in 1837, she was the biggest ship in the world. William Patterson was a canny Scots shipbuilder who had a reputation for building some pretty fast sailing ships with long, narrow hulls and fine lines, rather like the clipper ships we start to hear about later in the century. He'd also got plenty of experience building steamships, so he was just the man Brunel needed to build a ship like the Great Western. These are the lines that William Patterson drew. The Great Western worked a treat, and everybody in Bristol got quite excited that the city might now win a contract worth £40,000 a year to carry mail across to America with this new steamship. The trouble was, you needed more than one steamship to run a weekly mail service to America. So the contract went to Samuel Cunard of Liverpool. He had built 4 steamships, a little bit smaller than the Great Western, in record time. It seems as if the shipping industry's always been a little bit cutthroat like that. Bristolians were rather upset to be pipped at the post, but there was very little they could do about it, because Brunel's next ship, the Great Britain, was, well, you've guessed it, bigger than anything anybody else had built before. And she was made out of iron, and she had a screw propeller. Now that was revolutionary. Brunel hadn't invented any of the things which make the Great Britain tick. The steam engines, the iron construction, the screw propeller. Other people had invented these things, but Brunel had put them together in such a way, and on such a scale, that she set the shipbuilding industry back on its heels. It was also the start of a worrying time for Bristol shipbuilders, because the Great Britain's owners had a heck of a time getting her out of the old harbour. She never came back as a commercial ship. She proved to be very nearly the biggest ship that's ever been built here. The decline of Bristol shipbuilding had begun. These models show how dramatically the size of ships increased after the SS Great Britain right up to the present day. They got bigger and bigger and bigger. But there was no going back. Iron and steam were the thing from now on, and shipbuilding was to change dramatically over the next 30 years. Bristol's industry was badly affected because the harbour just wasn't big enough for these large new steamships. All this was a bit much for some of the old wooden shipbuilders like the Hill House family. They handed over the business to their manager, Charles Hill, in 1845. He hadn't got enough money, though, to re-equip the Albion dockyard to build iron ships, so for many years he continued running wooden second-hand sailing ships to make a little bit of money until things in the shipbuilding industry improved. Stoddart's, who took over Hill House's original dockyard in 1851, became pretty good at it, though. And they churned out lots of pretty dull but jolly hard-working iron steamships until the beginning of this century. This one, the Mayflower, was built by Stoddart's in 1861, only 18 years after the Great Britain was launched. She kept on working for nearly a century, towing barges and ships up the Gloucester Ship Canal. She's been rebuilt to working order by the city's Industrial Museum, and when she goes back into the water next year, she'll be the oldest Bristol-built ship afloat. Look at some of that plating and the rivets. They're over 125 years old. It's lasted that long because she's made out of wrought iron. It doesn't rust as quickly as steel. Steel, this is a piece, is much stronger and lighter than iron, though. And a steel ship can carry much more cargo than an iron ship of the same size. So it's not surprising that shipbuilders went over to using steel at the end of the last century, when new steelmaking processes brought the price of it rocketing down. Charles Hill finally re-equipped the Albion dockyard to make iron ships in 1881. But less than 8 years later, every new ship he was building was made out of steel. Even something as traditional in appearance as the last big commercial sailing ship that was built in Bristol by Hills in 1895, the Favelle, was made entirely out of riveted steel. Steam power, iron and then steel construction caused tremendous upheavals in shipbuilding at the end of the last century. Charles Hill & Sons were the only local firm who managed to adapt to all these changes, and it was touch and go for them for a while. However, things began to look up slowly, and they built up a good reputation for traditional craftsmanship and always delivering every ship on time. All their new ships built at the beginning of this century would be fitted with one of these, a triple expansion steam engine. Even though she was built for the Bristol Steam Navigation Company, there's nothing about the steam age in a ship like this. This is the Echo, built by Hills in 1957. She has a thoroughly modern welded steel hull and is driven along by powerful modern diesel engines. She was even modified in the 1960s to carry steel containers. But that's where history catches up with Bristol's oldest firm of shipbuilders. To go on building even larger versions of ships like this, which the modern shipping industry demands, Hills would have had to have moved to a new shipyard or closed the Albion dockyard altogether. As we've seen, Bristol's old harbour was too small even for the SS Great Britain. So about 100 years ago, the whole port was moved, as they say around here, down the mouth to new docks at the mouth of the River Avon. This one is the latest, a new container terminal called Royal Portbury, which opened in 1977. For some reason, none of the local shipbuilders moved down here. Had they done so, then they might have been able to build much larger ships, and I could have told you that that ship behind me was Bristol built. No such luck though, I'm afraid. She comes from Japan. This ship's a 47,000 tonner, that's more than 20 times bigger than the SS Great Britain. Bristol shipbuilders never seem to have produced more than about 2,000 tons of shipping in any one year. So at that rate, it would have taken more than 25 years to build a monster like this one. Still, it's good to see that the modern port can at least accommodate ships this size, and there's even a dry dock built in 1908 in which she can be repaired. So, here we are back in the Albion dockyard, where you can see that the old harbour of Bristol, which was once its key to fame and fortune, limited the size of its shipbuilding industry and eventually caused its complete decline. It must always have been difficult launching a ship into the harbour here. It wasn't unusual for one of Hill's new ships to go banging into the dock wall over on the other side there. Surprisingly, the last big ship to be built here was launched as recently as 1976. She came down a slipway over there. She was the Miranda Guinness, a tanker which now happily spends its time bringing thousands of gallons of Guinness from Dublin for the thirsty drinkers of Great Britain. Since then, the Albion dockyard has changed a lot. Part of it has become the Bristol Marina. But it's good to see things going on here that are keeping Bristol's proud shipbuilding traditions alive. Behind me, David Abels builds new welded steel ships. Prefabricated sections are put together in conditions which many an old Bristol shipwright would have envied. Repairing and restoring all the many and varied craft that you find in the harbour has become an industry in itself. And everywhere there's plastic, reinforced plastic, acres of it. I wonder what Hillhouse and Brunel would have made of all that. Enjoy the rest of your visit to this new Bristol Maritime Heritage Centre. And please, don't forget to buy your ticket to see the SS Great Britain before you leave the building. Goodbye.